Hello, and welcome to Literary Prospects, where we talk to authors and other literary professionals about books, publishing, and the writing life. I'm Kelley Vick, the host of the program, and it's my pleasure to introduce today's guest, debut author Adele Myers, who's here to discuss her novel, The Tobacco Wives. Adele Myers grew up in Asheville, North Carolina, and has a journalism degree from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She currently works in advertising and lives in Brooklyn, New York with her husband, son, and their rescue dog, Chipper. The Tobacco Wives is her first novel. So, let's get started. Adele Myers, thank you so much for joining us today, and congratulations on the publication of your first novel, The Tobacco Wives. This is a debut that is getting a lot of buzz, already appearing on a lot of best of lists for 2022. A starred review in Publishers Weekly calls it a sparkling debut. BuzzFeed says it's a vibrant and warm book that feels easy to pick up and hard to put down. And Booklist says debut novelist Myers sets her activist novel in 1946, but the causes of workers' and women's rights are timeless. So I'm looking forward to talking with you about that a little more later. But I could go on with the great reviews, but I'd like to actually be able to talk with you. So tell me, what's it like to have this book out in the world?
It's incredible. Today's the day that I've been waiting for all this time. And I'm really excited to go visit a couple of bookstores in my neighborhood and actually see it on the shelf. Like that will be the pinnacle moment. So yeah, it's kind of surreal. I've dreamed about doing this since I was a little girl. I've always wanted to write a novel at some point in my life. And I'm just so grateful that it's actually happening, and it's really exciting.
So tell me about the book, a little synopsis, if you will, and
Sure.
something about your inspiration for the book.
Sure. So the book, The Tobacco Wives, is the story of a young seamstress. She's 15 years old. Her name is Maddie Sykes. And she, the year of the book is set in is 1946, and her father has just been killed in World War II. And her mother has a breakdown and takes Maddie from their modest home in Western North Carolina to the tobacco capital of the South, which is the fictional town of Brightleaf, North Carolina. And in Brightleaf, Maddie assists her aunt, who is a seamstress for the most powerful tobacco magnates' wives, the women that everyone calls the tobacco wives. And Maddie begins to get drawn into their world. And initially, she's so enamored with these women. They seem wealthy and beautiful, and they have it all. And then she begins to see that there's another side to life in Brightleaf, and uncovers some dangerous information that she has to decide what to do with. So that's a little bit of a synopsis. The story was inspired by my childhood, spending a lot of time in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, which is where both sets of my grandparents lived. And one of my grandmothers was a hairdresser for the wives of R.J. Reynolds tobacco executives in the 1940s. And I was always fascinated just by the idea of that, and of that relationship. Also, I think is so interesting between a hairdresser and their client. What secrets might she hear? What might she overhear? And so that was the spark of the idea that ultimately led to the book many, many years later.
And you studied journalism in school, and you've been working in advertising in New York for some time. So how did you come to writing fiction?
I always wrote fiction on the side, and initially I focused more on short stories. I took classes at night. Shortly after I moved to New York, I took classes in short story writing. And one of my teachers, who I think that you had on in another episode, Alexandra Shelley, she was my teacher at the New School in a short story writing class. And I actually wrote a story about the Tobacco Wives. And I still have it. I found the article. I found it was an exercise, really, where she gave us some kind of a prompt, and then I riffed on it and wrote this story. And at the time, some of the notes that she had given me, she gave me feedback, of course, but she also said, I think there could be a longer piece here. I think you should consider expanding this. There might even be a novel here. And so that was in 2000. So that was 22 years ago. So I wrote other stories, but it's funny, that was always in the back of my mind. And I kept finding myself coming back to writing about these women, or this, idea of these women. And I guess about 8 years ago, I felt like I was ready to focus on this. I had been working in advertising for many years, and I was at a good point in my career. I have a son, and he's older. He was young during those years, and life just gets so busy. I felt like my writing kind of took a back seat.
Mhm.
But I really made it a priority about 8 years ago, and just started steadily working on it in between life and everything else I had going on.
And you've been very forthcoming about the fact that your path to publication, if you will, with this novel was not necessarily super straight and short. Can you tell us a little bit about what that was like and the road to publication?
Sure, absolutely. So I worked on the manuscript for many years, and I had a variety of different groups and friends and people that I relied on to give me feedback at different points. So I have a longtime book club where we read books. It's not about writing, but there, for 1 month, I printed out the manuscript and had my book club read it, and that was our book for the month. And they gave
What
me
a cool
feedback.
idea.
That was kind of terrifying. It's like, okay, be honest, but
Not too honest.
not too harsh. But it was interesting because that feedback was helpful, and I think what was most helpful is hearing the same feedback from multiple people. And at that time, the book was more focused on a friendship between Maddie, the main character, and the daughter of one of the wives. And I kept hearing from early readers that they weren't that interested in the daughter. Her name was Virginia, who she's since been killed off. She was cut from the book.
Maybe she can be in the next book.
Maybe she'll be resurrected in some other book. But anyway, so for many years, I did this with my book club. I had a writers group where we would critique each other. And I think I got a lot of confidence there because there were several women who had published books. Most of them were YA authors, but they looked at what I had written and they said, we really think you can get this published. And that was kind of a big confidence booster for me. So I feel like it was this trail of little breadcrumbs that that helped me get more and more confident. And then when I felt like I was in a good place with the manuscript, I started trying to find an agent. And that took quite a while. I had some contacts through friends and got some interest initially in the manuscript, but wasn't the right fit for a variety of reasons. I really think in some ways you have to just get lucky, and the right person has to look at it at the right time and get excited about it and want to take it on. And for me, it took about 1.5 years for that to happen and to find my agent. And then once I started working with her, she had a lot of great ideas for making the book even better. And so it's funny, I kept thinking, okay, I'm done with this. I'm done with the manuscript now. I felt done when I sent it out to agents, which is so naive. so once I got my
Like that's
agent,
when you should be done. You're ready to.
well, it was like the first phase of being done, but I had about 4 or 5 more rounds of kind of really rewriting the book in some respects, because one big change that I discussed with her and that we decided on was the protagonist in earlier versions was much younger. She was 11, 12 years old. And so we decided to age her up to 15, which is what she is now, a very mature 15. And so I had to go back and really go through the whole book and change her voice, because there's a big difference between the voice of an 11-year-old and the voice of a 15-year-old, and also what they perceive.
Mm-hmm.
But that was, I think, an important change, because Maddie saw the world differently. She had more insight. There was a romantic, there's a love interest in the book now that wasn't a part of it when she was much younger.
Do you think that your openness to revision and listening and making big changes to the story is part of the key to your success?
I think so. Absolutely. I think it's a balance, I think, that you have to try to strike, because it's a solitary exercise to write a book initially. But when you start to work with an agent, or even when we sold the book and I started working with my editor, she also had ideas and changes and things she suggested. And so it's been interesting to me to learn when to listen and when to trust my own gut and push back.
Mm-hmm.
And thankfully, almost everything that we ended up changing, I was in agreement with, which is great. But I think if you're too precious about your work,
Mm-hmm.
it makes it much harder. And if there are people, when I first met my agent, first spoke with her, I just knew that we had this rapport and I trusted her from the get-go. And so that trust, I think, is really important. And I was open, and I would recommend that authors try to be open to that, because there are people who've, I had never published a book. This is my first novel. So, and it seems to have worked out. So
I'd say so, Adele. I think it's worked out pretty well.
It's worked out pretty well. Yeah.
What was it about this particular story that kept you going through, 22 years, did we say, from the beginning,
Yes.
that short
Yes.
story to now? So, I mean, that's a
Yes.
long time to stick with one thread and one story. So what was it about this that you felt like this is the one?
I think I have just a really deep connection to my family history and to Winston-Salem. I grew up in Asheville, North Carolina, but I spent my summers in Winston-Salem with both sets of my grandparents. And I have so many great memories of just time with my grandmothers. And I already mentioned the one who's the hairdresser, but my other grandmother was a seamstress. And I actually have pictures of them if you want me to do a little show and tell.
Yeah, can you?
Yes. So this is my grandmother who's the hairdresser.
Oh,
And
it's very chic.
yeah, she's actually holding a cigarette. And it's so funny. There's so many pictures of women and men too posing with cars from the 40s. And I don't even know if that was her car, but they just, would stand next to a car, because
I never really thought about that, but
novel.
now that you mention it,
Yeah,
everybody seems to be posing by a car.
They are.
Okay.
And then this one is a little harder to see, but this is my other grandmother, my maternal grandmother, and she was a seamstress.
Oh, wow.
And so I would spend my summers, my brother and I, tagging along with both of them. And Winston-Salem at that time, this was in the 70s. So people still smoked, and the science about how dangerous it was had started to come out, but there was still a tremendous amount of pride in Winston-Salem about building the tobacco capital of the South.
Mm-hmm.
And my grandfather worked in banking, and the bank was basically built, with cigarette funds. I mean, the whole town of Winston-Salem really is funded by tobacco money. And my other grandfather worked in a tobacco factory, and he was a home builder. And my father worked in a factory when he was a teenager during his summers. So I thought, when I was a little girl, I think I was enamored with these women because I admired them. When I was older, I started to look at that time in history, and I became even more interested because I realized that in many ways, these women, even though they were wealthy, even though they were privileged,
Mhm.
they had very little real power. They were reliant on their husbands. And the other thing that intrigued me is just thinking about that time in history when this whole community that was so proud of this industry began to realize that what they were doing was harmful and even killing people.
Mhm.
How do you reconcile that? So it just felt like rich territory for me to explore that was very deeply connected to my family and my history and who I am.
And to do historical fiction well, which is what you've done here, I mean, you have to do so much research,
You
even if it
do.
is in your family background. So, can you talk a
Right.
little bit about how your research process went for this book? It must have been very in depth.
Sure. It was in depth and it took several different forms. I did have like one-on-one conversations with my family members who are still alive. My grandparents have passed away, so unfortunately, I couldn't talk to them, but I have lots of pictures and letters, and I was able to talk with my father and my mother, and got some stories that I had not heard before, which was interesting because I thought I pretty much knew everything, but they were able to shed some light on things that ended up in the book that surprised me. And then I also, of course, Googled and dug into research. I mean, we're so fortunate that we can find anything and everything online now.
Mhm.
And it's much easier, I think. I delved into also the whole history of the downfall of big tobacco, and was able to even look at the congressional hearings, transcripts, memos during the cover-up period. It's well documented, the deceptive advertising and the role that took in this. That was a whole nother area that I have experience in, having worked in advertising all these years. And that was really interesting. And I'm very inspired by photos and by old photos. So I created Pinterest boards where I pinned all kinds of, I mean, almost everything every scene I had to write about, I had to make sure it was historically accurate. So for instance, there's a scene in a hospital in a maternity ward. And so I have whole, collections of photos of what that was like at that time. And it's different than now. The delivery rooms were usually one huge room with all the women and just like little curtains around them. But then I had to consider that my character Mitzi is wealthy, so would she be in the main room? Probably not. I mean, it's a lot to think through.
It's very involved. And
Yes.
speaking of very involved, Maddie, your main character, is, of course, a seamstress for these tobacco wives. And there
Right.
are all of these very detailed, beautiful passages describing the intricacies of her work and these beautiful dresses these
Mhm.
women wore. So it made me wonder, did you have to do, I know you said your grandmother was a seamstress and you had spent some time with her, but do you still
Right.
sew that much, or was this
No, I
all
do
okay?
not. I do not sew at all.
Okay.
So I do not sew. So I had to watch videos, read blogs about sewing to, talk about the different techniques and come up with all that. I did help my grandmother, but she did not let me help the way that Maddie helped. I, I, I remember uh, cutting out some of the patterns and laying them down. I mean, I do have these visceral memories of being around her and being around that
Mhm.
world. And so I think that's where that came from, but it didn't extend into my adulthood.
Do you feel like you want to start again now?
It's funny. I've been thinking about that. I've been getting that question a lot. And so it's occurred to me, maybe I should take a class
Now you have all
or
this
something.
knowledge.
Yeah, I can talk it. I know, and I can talk enough to pretend that I know what I'm doing, but
Well, that's a good head start.
yes, it is. It is.
You did play a little bit with the timeline in the novel regarding when certain tobacco studies were released.
Right.
Can you speak a little bit about your decision to do that without giving too many
Sure.
spoilers, of course?
Sure. So I played around with a couple of things. One is that in the book, the science that comes out is related to women and their health.
Mhm.
The initial science that did come out, which came out later, it was closer to the late 1950s, early 60s, as
Mhm.
opposed to when my book was in 1946. That science was around lung cancer, and it was studied only in men, which is something that I discovered during the course of this research is very common. Many medical studies for many, many years were only conducted on men, and then the
Wow.
results are applied to women as well, but have not been studied in women's bodies. And it's amazing. If you look into it, you may even find, I think I saw a study that said the recommendation for someone at risk for heart attack to take an aspirin a day. And I don't know if that's still being recommended, but for a long time, that was a recommendation to take
Mhm.
like a baby aspirin a day. And that was based on science only of looking at men. Um, so yeah, so I had to take some liberties with that because it didn't exist. The first Surgeon General's report about the dangers of smoking came out, and it was focused on lung cancer and lung disease. And then it took 16 years for a study to come out about the maternal fetal effects of smoking.
Wow.
Yeah. So I did take liberty with that. The other reason that I also wanted to set this book at a particular time, right as World War II was ending and all the troops were coming back, because there's another storyline in the book around the fact that women have taken over jobs at the cigarette factories, and they're getting a taste for the first time in probably all of them in their lives of being able to work and make their own money and take care of themselves. And it really awakens something in these women. And many say that that period was the beginning of the modern civil rights, women's rights movement. So I thought I wanted to set it there because I was interested in the juxtaposition between these wealthy tobacco wives and then the women who, the working class women.
Mhm.
And I thought it was interesting to look at who, who was more privileged, the women who were able to work and get that sense of self-esteem and know that they could support themselves, or these women who are relying on their husbands but living in these mansions. So I wanted to play around with that a little bit and look at and have Maddie see that, have my main character experience both worlds. So
And being set in the South in 1946, the novel includes a pretty diverse cast of characters in addition to women's rights and workers' rights, which we discussed. You're also touching on LGBTQ rights in this book. It's historical, but at the same time, it feels very modern. So, how did you do that?
well, I don't know. I really don't know the answer to that. I I wanted I felt that the characters, like I'm usually very character led. And so I start with developing the characters, and so I didn't kind of set out and say, okay, I need to represent certain groups. I really just started with these characters and then the way Maddie saw the world. So the book is told from her point of view.
Mhm.
So it's what she sees. And I did wrestle a little bit with, for instance, there are multiple characters who are gay in the book, but it's never talked about openly. It's talked of, and I wanted to get that right. And at that time, it was still very much hidden in the South, in the 40s. And yet Maddie knew, and she didn't have an issue with it, but others did, and that came through. So I did spend quite a bit of time making sure that I represented that accurately for that time period.
And for your day job, you work in advertising, we've talked about, and you've worked in PR. And a lot of that insider knowledge you have about the business worked its way into this novel as well. Can you speak a little to that?
Sure. And I do have more show and tell if you would like to see.
Great.
A couple of real ads that ran during those years. And what was really alarming was that they used doctors in cigarette ads. So
not one single case of throat irritation. Camels.
Right. Yes.
There's a very authoritative looking doctor for those
there is
listening.
an authoritative looking doctor. Start your own 30-day camel mildness test today. So they positioned them as being good, being healthy. This is another very famous one. Also a camel ad, and this one says, "More doctors smoke camels than any other cigarette."
Well, there you have it.
There you have it. And these are real. And the doctor's choice is America's choice. So at that time, there was very little regulation in advertising. And so it was really the Wild West. I mean, you could say what you wanted to say, and really in many ways it was brilliant what they did, the tobacco companies, because they got out ahead of the negative science and started touting cigarettes as healthy. So brilliant, but evil, I should add, because a lot of people started and then could not stop smoking, and it's extremely addictive. Of course, we know that now, and I think at the time they knew, and yet a lot of the advertising really touted the health benefits. And it's interesting because some of the techniques that they used are things that are still used today. And I've worked in the field for so long. I don't blame advertising. I think advertising is information, right? It's information, and but the way that it's communicated, how it's positioned, the truth or falsity that's included is where I think problems arise. And that's exactly what happened with big tobacco. And thankfully now we have regulations that prevent companies from coming out and saying the types of things that they said at that time. But you still see issues. I mean, I've been following what's going on with e-cigarettes and with vaping, and the FDA is just beginning to crack down on them for advertising and for developing products that were candy flavors that appeal to young people. So they're claiming that they're not targeting young people, but the flavors themselves are cotton candy, bubble gum. So it's pretty clear what's going on there.
When you were doing all of this research, even coming at it from knowing what you know now, were there things that just really shocked you when you were looking at these old advertisements? And
there were, and I actually posted some old ads the other day on social media, and I did a little quiz. I asked people which I had, it's like the game Two Truths and a Lie. So I had 2 ads that were real and 1 that was not real. And some of the ads used babies in the ads, saying, "Mommy, you really love your Marlboro or whatever. And there was one with a pregnant woman that talked about how smoking can help you keep your weight down for an easier delivery, which is frightening.
Wow.
What else? So the fact that they used babies, some of these ads, I was shocked that they were real.
And I was going to
And
say these two that you did were not the lie.
right, the one with the baby was not the lie. And yeah, and the other one, there was one featuring a photo of a woman who was very pregnant smoking. And some people realized that one was not true because at that time it was not acceptable to show a pregnant woman at all. So a photo of a pregnant woman would not have been in an ad. So some
Even
people
though really that's the least shocking.
right? Yeah, because that's really shocking. The fact that she's smoking is not, but the fact that she's, yeah.
When compared to the other two.
Right, right.
You were working full time while you were writing this book, and you're also a parent.
Yeah.
So, how logistically did you find the time to get
Uh,
this done?
it was hard. And I think that's why it took me 8 years.
Mhm.
It was spread out over so much time. And I went through phases where I didn't work on it for a month or two, and then I would come back to it and I would take a week off and really focus on certain elements. Then I would. I also have always, in the back of my mind, thought about stories and I going about my day, like sometimes even during my commute to work or, when I'm in the shower, ideas pop up. So I always have pads kind of nearby and scroll things down, and I'll get an idea for a character, or I'll see someone in a coffee shop, and think, oh, that's a character trait that I should use somewhere. So it's almost like I'm never not writing because I'm always gathering gathering information just from going through my day.
Do you have a specific routine for when you are like sitting down and you're in front of the computer? Or do you do the whole like get up at 4 a.m. before you go to work thing? Or
I don't. I What I did do is I invested in joining a writer space near
Mhm.
where I live so that I could physically leave my apartment. And definitely on the weekends, I would block out 3 to 4 hours. And usually I would go earlier in the day so that I could work around when my son was up. But I needed to remove myself from my home in order to do that. And then at lunchtime, I would go to a coffee shop near my office and I would write there. I tended to write on the computer first. So I'd write a chapter and then I'd print it out and carry it around with me and make notes on it
Mhm.
during my commute. And then during lunch, I would, continue to make notes on it. It was a very messy process, but it worked.
Do you consider yourself like a plotter or a pantser, as they say? Are you just sort of letting it flow out, or do you have sometimes outlines or half and half? Or
I would say I'm an evolving pantser. I was definitely a pantser early on. I just whatever came out, I wrote, and it was harder when I was younger to take feedback. If someone said, "Well, we don't understand what's going on here." What do you mean? It just felt like there was this art flowing from me, and then as I grew as a writer, I've learned how to plot. And I learned a lot of that too, just through the process of working on this book and then going on to work with my agent and my editor. And I'm beginning to think about a next book and what I would want to do. And I'm still starting with character though. I always start with character and the sense of place and what's the main conflict. And then from there, the plot I think sometimes comes from these scenes. Like I'll just have an image of a scene that I know I want in the book somewhere. And so it becomes a matter of shuffling things around and figuring out, okay, where does that go? And when should this happen? And how do you keep the reader interested, but not give them too much? There's so much to it. I've learned so much in the last couple of years getting this book ready.
What do you wish you'd known before publishing your first novel that you know now?
What do I wish I'd known? Well, one thing I did and I discovered that I would recommend other writers do is I wish I had known how important the pitch is, the pitch that you go out to an agent with. And I discovered that the hard way because I was pitching and pitching, and I think I had 50 to 60 rejections. And I must have read somewhere how important it is that you really nail that pitch letter. And at that time, the book also had a different title. And I decided to change the title. It actually changed 3 times. So when I first started, it was called The Clearing. And there was a really pivotal scene in the middle of a field in this clearing. And so that scene got cut. So it wasn't relevant anymore. Then I titled the book Bright Leaf, which is the name of the town, which I think is a perfectly fine title. But at a certain point, I realized the real seed of the idea was these tobacco wives. And these women are what all my early readers were interested in. And I was like, let me change the title. And so I changed the title and I searched online and found all these examples of winning pitch letters that other authors had, like, this is their pitch that got them their agent. And I spent a lot of time reworking it and I got a lot more interest. Like that made a big difference. So I think that piece of it, I wish I had known earlier, and I probably would have paid more attention to earlier on.
That's really great advice and really great to know, actually. Who do you consider your main author influences?
Oh, wow. There's so many. I would say one of them definitely Maya Angelou. I really, when I was a teenager and I read I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, that book just really struck me and has always stayed with me. And I even go back to it sometimes and reread it, especially when I'm beginning to work on something new. It just feels like home, like these books that we have that somehow hit us, at different points in our lives. I also really love Pat Conroy, another Southern voice that I just adore him. Flannery O'Connor. There's so many great Southern writers. And I live in Brooklyn and I've lived in New York since college, so for the last 20 plus years. But the voices that stay with me are the Southern writers.
Is there a particular book that you find yourself recommending to people most?
I don't think there's any one. I tend to have like my last favorite thing is what I will.
What's your last favorite?
My last favorite book. I just read a book by another debut author who I've become friendly with. We actually share an editor, and it's called Shadows of Pecan Hollow. And it's based in Texas. It's kind of this gritty, slow burn of a story about these hustlers. And it's been likened to Paper Moon, the movie Paper Moon, which features this little girl, Tatum O'Neal, and her father, who are, tricking people out of their money, and there are heists. And so I just finished that, and it's amazing. So I tend to, whatever I've just read that I love is what I'll recommend.
I'm the same way, so I totally get
Yeah.
it. Um, do you have I'm sort of giving you the quick fire questions in case you hadn't noticed. Do you have
Um,
a favorite writing exercise?
hmm. I would say at one point I did this, I guess you'd call it a program. It's based on a book called The Artist's Way. I don't know if you've ever
Mhm.
heard of this,
Yeah.
by Julia Cameron. And
Mhm.
so part of that is doing what's called, for people who don't know, what's called morning pages. So you basically, first thing in the morning, you just start writing stream of consciousness, and just, it doesn't have to make sense. You're not trying to write something beautiful. You're just getting out what's in your head. And I find that very helpful. And I do return to that at times, because you'll sometimes find a really interesting nugget of something in those, but also it just clears your head. And you know, we've always got thoughts swirling and things going on and distractions, and it just kind of helps to clear that away.
All right. I'm going to round it out with my favorite
Yes.
last question.
Oh boy. Okay.
If or when your book is made into a movie or TV series, what would you pick for the theme song?
Oh gosh. Wow. Um, wow. That's a
Because while
tough
you're thinking, I
one.
will say that as I was reading this, I could see how beautifully this would look on screen.
Oh, feel free to tell all the
Yeah.
movie stars about that if you'd like. I absolutely, absolutely it would. Um, well, it would have to be a Southern song, and I'm thinking either, you know, Dolly Parton's version of "I Will Always Love You" is an unbelievable
Oh,
song, and there is this very, I think there's just a love of the land and the people and the community and all of that. So while that might not seem like an obvious choice for this kind of story, that's what popped into my mind.
that's a great one. I love it. It's a great choice.
Yeah.
Adele, thank you so much for spending time with me today and
Sure.
talking about your wonderful book and your amazing writing process. And everybody, read The Tobacco Wives. It's fantastic.
Thank
Congratulations
you so much.
again.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I really enjoyed speaking with you,
I
and I
really enjoyed talking with you
all the
too.
support. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us on Literary Prospects. If you like what you heard, please click subscribe and leave us a review. We'll see you next time.